This week on Brian Ross Investigates, missing in action. With President Trump seemingly checked out on the COVID-19 response, what will that mean for our country? We'll hear from the former acting Surgeon General. Will it cost lives, you think, in the end?
I think without a doubt.
Plus, a call for help, a rare interview from inside a federal prison hit with COVID-19.
The warden came to the female institution and she said, "Your purpose here is to serve the men's institution."
Then, whistleblower revenge. What happens when a former spy and famed whistleblower discovers his wife is having an affair at her workplace?
I called the company's ethics hotline. It's just the way we're wired.
And this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite.
Biden wants to fund the police.
Sir, he does not.
From the Law&Crime Trial Network, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. And I'm joined tonight, as always, by my colleague at the Law&Crime Network, Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we begin with a call for help from inside a federal prison from a female inmate who is concerned about the spread of COVID-19 there.
Brian, coronavirus infections in prison are on the rise. More than 64,000 people in state and federal prisons have tested positive for COVID, a 13% increase this month, the highest rate of infection so far, according to data collected by the Marshall Project and the Associated Press. So the infections are on the rise.
And as you know, Rhonda, it's rare to hear from a prisoner directly inside a federal prison. But one prisoner there, a female by the name of Denise, serving time for mortgage fraud, called the Law&Crime Network and said she wanted to speak out, even if it meant that she'd be punished for doing so.
The women were forced, and I want to make this clear to the public, were forced to go into a male institution, to the men's medium. Coleman is the largest federal prison complex in the United States. There are 5 prisons there and approximately 6,500 inmates. And there was a fairly decent outbreak at the men's medium facility. The women were forced to go in. The warden came to the female institution and she said, "Your purpose here is to serve the men's institution." I don't know if she thinks we're in 1950 or what, but she then sent all kinds of women to cook for the men and do their laundry. And now there are 60, within 2 weeks of that decision, there are 60 positive COVID cases at Coleman Camp, where there had been none during this entire pandemic.
The women were ordered to go in and essentially be the domestic employees for the males, where there was a...
That is correct. And now the women are also, and I understand several of them have been hospitalized. Yes, the women are... over 60. That was yesterday.
And
was the number I got. That's it.
And the women can't refuse.
Ahead,
I take it. If the warden says you have to do it, you have to do it.
Correct. If you refuse, you're likely to receive an incident report, which could make you lose good time, spend more. It could range from anything to, I'm sure, a loss of some type of privilege, phone, email, loss of if you have a job like at Unicor or some other high-paying or decent, high-paying, relatively speaking, to prison, or actual loss of good time. You could spend more time in prison that would be considered refusing disobeying a direct order, and you could have all of those sanctions for that.
So do the women have any recourse at all?
Not really, no, which is why so many of them went, and now that's why they're sick. You have to be prepared, and most people are not. You have to be prepared to be penalized if you choose what they want you to do.
And how about the fact that you're speaking here publicly?
It's very possible.
When we last talked, we said you were essentially punished for talking with me last time.
That is correct. Yes. I was punished for you, I believe, and I was punished for talking to you and to the Miami Herald. I try to be fair-minded and just speak facts if I speak to the press. So nothing ever, besides being moved, and then I got stuck in the COVID, And now I've been stuck in the Oklahoma Transit Center since I was moved around what they call diesel therapy from February 28th to March 13th. I was sent to Tallahassee. Then I was sent to Lovejoy, Georgia, to one of the GEO private prisons. And then I was shipped here.
Why do they call it diesel therapy?
Because they move you around. And that's an inside term. It's a form of punishment because you never know where you're going to go. I was treated. I was handcuffed, shackled at the waist through a waist chain. Like I was like in a maximum security area, even though I'm a community custody camper. They made it clear they knew about both reports, both talking to, that I was talking to the press.
So you've paid a pretty high price. In other words, you could be free right now.
Yes. Unfortunately, yes, I absolutely paid a very high price. I don't regret it, though, but I will continue to speak out because there needs to be light shed on the Bureau of Prisons and how they conduct themselves and the outrageous misconduct that they engage in on almost a daily basis. I mean, there are some decent people in it, but they are far in the minority to the people who treat us like we're animals.
And Rhonda, we heard from the Bureau of Prisons late today. They deny punishing anybody for speaking with reporters.
That's right. They declined our request for an interview, but they did say that female inmates were required to assist in meal preparation for male prisoners, but did not come into any contact with male prisoners. And they point everyone to their website where they describe aggressive measures they put in place, they say early in February with the guidance of the CDC, and that they're limiting visitors and providing masks to everyone. And now they're increasing testing of asymptomatic prisoners. So they believe they've had a very aggressive response.
To get more insight into all this, I talked earlier with Erin Haney. She's the policy director at the Reform Alliance, a group that seeks prison reform. Thank you for being here. And as you've just heard from the inmate inside the federal prison system, Denise, they are deathly afraid of what's happening. A recent report by Johns Hopkins and UCLA reported the death rate was 3 times as high for inmates as for the non-inmate population.
It's absolutely devastating when we look at what's happening inside of our jails and our prisons. I remember we talked back in April and we discussed how fearful folks behind bars were, how fearful their families were. And at that time, we were really hopeful that there was something that could be done to try to stop this expedited spread and deadly spread of the virus behind bars. And it has been just absolutely heartbreaking to see that, in fact, it has spread so rapidly and that it has been so devastating to people behind bars.
Some non-violent offenders near the end of their sentence have been released. Is that doing any good?
Absolutely. So the more people that we can get out from behind bars and the more that we can do that safely and swiftly, the safer it is for the folks that are left behind bars, the safer it is for the correctional officers, and the safer it is for the communities at large. We know that what happens behind bars does not stay behind bars. When there is an outbreak in one of these prisons, it very quickly translates to the rest of the community. So ensuring that we are freeing up as much space as possible so that people behind bars can quarantine, can social distance as much as possible, and can be as safe as possible is extremely important. So every single release that occurs is hugely important in this fight against the virus. When we look at a state, for example, like California, which is now thinking about releasing thousands and thousands of people, it is a really brave and courageous decision that they made to do that in order to keep the community safe.
As you know from your work with the Reform Alliance, getting sympathy for inmates, for prisoners in state and federal facilities can often be difficult. Have you found that to be a problem in this case?
Absolutely. So I think especially right now in times when people are incredibly concerned about their own families, about their own well-being, it's really common for people to think, why should I care about somebody behind bars, somebody who maybe did something wrong, was convicted of something? And so one of the biggest challenges has been changing the narrative to remind people the folks behind bars are people's children, they're people's grandparents, they are human beings. None of them were sentenced to death by virus. And it is incredibly important that we give them that dignity and that safety that the rest of us are craving. And with many, many people who can be released safely, that's exactly what it means. It means allowing them to go back into the community. There's still accountability. There's still monitoring. There's a lot of safeguards in place to ensure that when they go back, they are going back safely. And it frees up space for those people behind bars who cannot be safely released, but who still, again, have the right to live and need to be treated as human beings and need to be safe.
Erin, ironically, do you think this pandemic will help highlight the issues of the incredible incarceration rates in this country?
I think one of the things that we are seeing with these releases is that there are a great number of people who are currently behind bars who may in fact not need to be there. We've known for some time now that we have an over-incarceration problem in this country. We've known for some time that over-incarceration is deadly and devastating. And this virus has really, really highlighted that. So one of the things that we are seeing is that when people are moved from behind bars and back into their community where they can be safe, where they can contribute, we're actually seeing crime rates drop. And we are seeing an overall positive outcome in the community. We're having correctional officers come forward and saying, you know, it's actually much, much better for my job if the people who don't need to be behind bars are in fact back in the community. So we are seeing a dramatic overall positive effect. And we are incredibly hopeful that that is one of the lessons that we can take from this tragic, tragic situation.
The notion of throw the book at them, lock them all up, do you think that is going to slowly fade away, or is there going to be a new push for that, given President Trump's call now for law and order?
The law and order rhetoric and narrative has been along for so long, has been around for so long. And it's such a powerful, powerful rhetoric. For decades, politicians have been afraid of doing anything that could be seen as soft on crime. And it's really been these decades of making policy based on exceptions. So the most heinous cases, the most unusual cases have led to many of these policies where we have thrown the book at people. And I think that what we are seeing right now is that what really matters are safe outcomes. And so if what gives us the best chance at safety is in fact letting people out and into the community, then that is something that we absolutely have to move toward. And so we are seeing a number of courageous politicians. I mentioned earlier, you know, Governor Gavin Newsom has just announced that he is going to release over 8,000 people from California's prisons. These are all people who can be released safely. These are all people who would be getting out soon anyway, but it's a very, very large number. And we have seen some politicians leading by example and doing courageous things to make us all safer.
Finally, the death toll so far inside state and federal prisons is just above 500 inmates who died of COVID-19. Do you expect that number to go much higher, or is it going to level off?
I hope with all of my heart that it levels off. Again, these are people's grandmothers and children's who are behind bars. And so we really, really hope that it levels off. But I have to say, when we spoke back in April, we were talking about around 20,000 people who had tested positive behind bars. We are now very close to 70,000 people. We are looking at prisons like San Quentin in California, where 2 months ago, they had 0 positive cases, and now they are well over 1,000 positive cases. And so what we have seen is that when states have been slow to implement Reform Alliance's Safer Plan and the plan of many organizations and many advocates who have called for ensuring that some of these CDC protections get to folks behind bars. When states have been slow to do that, sadly, we have seen death tolls rise. And I think that until and unless we make some very big changes, which do include safe releases, we're going to continue to see those numbers climb.
Thank you so much for joining us again tonight.
Thank you.
Erin Haney, the Policy Director for the Reform Alliance. Coming up, back to school, will it be safe? We'll speak with one of the country's top public health experts on that very pressing issue. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. More now on the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump has now announced he'll continue or resume his White House briefings on the issue, although the Washington Post reported that may be more about his sagging poll numbers than anything else. The president's leadership on this issue, or lack of it, has been of great concern to many top public health officials, including Dr. Boris Lushniak. He's the former commissioner of the Public Health Service. He was the acting Surgeon General during the Obama administration, and he's now dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Health. Dr. Lushniak, thank you so much for being with us here this evening. It has become increasingly clear the President of the United States has made a decision not to be actively involved in dealing with this pandemic. From your point of view, what are the implications of that?
Well, I think those are very severe implications. I spent 28 years in the federal government at the CDC, at the FDA, and within the Office of the U.S. Surgeon General. And we spent many years planning for really bad public health crises such as this. And one of the key features in all our planning is the idea that we need to have leadership. We need to have leadership from the national level to be able to take control of a crisis like this and to be able to deal with a crisis like this. And I think the fact that the president is in essence washing his hands of this, putting out all sorts of claims and then putting responsibilities back on the states is not the right approach. It's not something that we had planned for. It's not something that we had practiced for in the federal level. And it's one of the things that obviously is causing this major crisis to get worse.
And will it cost lives, you think, in the end?
I think without a doubt. I think, a simple fact of how far we've gotten behind on the testing, the tracing, the idea of isolating or quarantining individuals, that's part of the puzzle. And right off the bat, we, back in February, ran into problems, yes, with the CDC test, but the bounce back has never really occurred. It is true. The president is right. We're testing now more than we ever have before. The problem, of course, is now there's a huge gap time between testing and getting the results. That's not leading towards public health accomplishments in the midst of this testing. Along the same lines, the idea of getting the messaging out there with masks, the idea of preventing this, that's a key feature that needs to be undertaken.
Over the weekend, President Trump went on Fox News and was asked by Chris Wallace about this, and he sought again to minimize the impact. Let's look at this and get your reaction to what he said to Chris Wallace on Fox News.
Many of those cases are young people that would heal in a day. They have the sniffles, and we put it down as a test. Many of them, don't forget, I guess it's like 99.7%. People are going to get better, and in many cases, they're going to get better very quickly. We go out and we look, and then on the news, look, if you go back to the news, all of even your wonderful competitors, you'll see cases are up. Well, cases are up. Many of those cases shouldn't even be cases. Cases are up because we have the best testing in the world, and we have the most testing. No country has ever done what we've done in terms of testing. We are the envy of the world, they call, and they say the most incredible job anybody's done is our job on testing, because we're going to very shortly be up to 50 million tests.
So, Doctor, this sort of nonsensical argument that we only have cases because we're testing and that young people get it, they just have the sniffles. Address both of those points, if you would, please.
Well, first of all, without a doubt, the younger you are, the less of a problem this is, but it's not a zero problem, right? We know that mortality goes up as one's age goes up. That's a given. But also the idea that somehow this is over in a day. We do know that some people are totally asymptomatic, but the key feature here is what? The key feature is that this is leading to spreading further disease to those who are vulnerable. Right? So what do we have right now? If this were all done, 99.7% is harmless, then why are intensive care units filling up, right? Why is the death rate starting to increase once again? Why is the medical care system getting overburdened and once again incapable of surging? This is not a benign disease. Some individuals, it is a benign course for you as an individual. But in reality, in society, this has incredible repercussions, both with the numbers of people who are infected, with the numbers who have to be hospitalized, with the numbers that have to be put into intensive care situation, and yes, now with the numbers that are going to be dying.
And what are the trend lines you see for the next several months, for the remainder of the summer in this country?
Well, we do our comparisons all the time. And I used to say early on that we were blessed at the beginning because China was ahead of us in terms of having this pandemic spreading through China. Europe was ahead of us, and we were sort of third in line. We're the third epicenter, right? And what we had thought was going to happen was, okay, we'll see what's done correctly in China and in Europe. We'll see what's done incorrectly. And because we're third in line for this spread, we'll see the trending follow the patterns that other countries are following if we do things right, or we'll buck the system and do things differently so that we continue on a downward trend. What happened? China went up, went down. Europe, 2 to 4 weeks ahead of us, went up, went down. We went up, then down, and then we leveled off. And now what we're seeing is a spike of that leveling. So the trending right now is towards further increases of that spike. That's the concern. And don't forget, we had perhaps, a sense that maybe the summer will be somewhat different for us. This is a novel virus. We've not dealt with this virus before. We weren't sure how it was going to behave. But we also knew that in past pandemics, influenza, for example, there always had been a lull over the summertime. This lull never occurred with coronavirus.
And so where do you see us in September and October?
Well, right now we have to start turning things around from this continuation of the first surge. People always worry about a second surge happening. We've never left the first surge. That's our problem. And so where we were originally bracing for this idea that we'll have a lull over summer and we have to brace ourselves for a second surge in September, October, November, December as we go into the winter months. Now we're still in the first surge, and the second surge will undoubtedly happen sometime down the line. So we have to brace ourselves for a few very difficult months ahead of us.
It seems the only real answer is the development of a vaccine. From your point of view, how is that progressing?
Well, again, a vaccine is part of the puzzle. And we certainly know that, right now there's a handful of vaccine candidates globally that are being looked at. 4 that are being supported by the U.S. government financially. And the hope is one or more of these vaccines are going to work. The reports that are coming out right now is maybe we'll have something by the fall that may be viable as a vaccine. Don't forget that we have to look at 2 things regarding vaccines. One is, does it work? The second is, it's safe. So there needs to be a whole lot of testing going on in the population prior to being put out there. And then we have the issue of producing enough of this vaccine to cover the population. So although we may have candidate vaccines by, as they're saying now, late fall, early winter, perhaps early 2021, we're certainly not going to have enough of this to cover the whole population. But the vaccine isn't the only thing that's going to save us right now. We have to go back to public health basics. And the message still continues similarly to what we had in the past. Put on the mask. Stay away from others, wash your hands. Those are critical components of stopping the spread of COVID-19.
They seem so simple, yet so many people seem to resent them and fight against them. It's become such a political issue, amazingly.
Amazingly, I don't know how this happened, and again, I blame leadership on this, right? Leadership resisted two things, right? They resisted on the front is this real? Is this going to be a problem? And somehow that spin of questioning, is this a real pandemic and how serious is it really, continues now 6-7 months after the first case came here in the United States. The second aspect of this is the idea that there is no sense of giving an example and leadership, right, of how this needs to be prevented. Mixed messages. You have portions of the administration, the Surgeon General, the Assistant Secretary for Health, Dr. Fauci at NIH, all pushing a message, but then you have the leader of the country backing off from that message. Inconsistent messaging leads to a population that is very confused in the midst of a public health crisis. This is salvageable, right? It's salvageable by getting back on board with consistent health communication based on good science.
And finally, let me ask you about schools, from your school, the University of Maryland, all the way down to pre-K. Should the schools be reopened this fall? What are the implications of all of that?
Well, at the University of Maryland, what are we planning on? For starting date is August 31st. We're trying to plan for roughly 20% of all our classes, undergraduate classes, to be held in person. These are classes where the in-person experience is critical for that class to be successful. However, 80% are going to be online. We're also planning on having some of our students return to the dorms, again, taking into account the factors of density. I can't have students living on top of each other. Regarding mask use, regarding the idea of canceling major events. We're going to have to see how all this goes. And the K-12 is under similar circumstances. I think the next few weeks in particular are going to be critical as to whether all these plans fall into place or not. By putting a lot of people together, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's at a university or a dorm setting, I'll be honest with you, we are increasing risk. We are increasing risk for the spread of COVID-19. So we have to be very careful in this decision making.
And the president seems to be pushing to open schools at any cost.
And again, that goes against the grain of every single public health expert out there, of all his advisors regarding this, who know something about public health. The people pushing for school reopenings are people who don't understand the spread of this disease, who don't understand how critical it is for us to be aggressive about stopping its spread.
Dr. Boris Lushniak, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Coming up next, the legal tangle involving a former CIA spy and renowned whistleblower who turned his skills against his ex-wife during an ugly divorce proceeding. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. July 30th is known by many as National Whistleblower Day. And today and tonight, we have a story about a renowned whistleblower and former CIA spy who got in all sorts of legal hot water when he turned his attentions to his former wife during an ugly divorce proceedings. His name is John Kiriakou, Rhonda.
That's right, Brian. And you will remember we first met John Kiriakou in 2007. He gave a dramatic interview to you at ABC News in which he was the first CIA officer, a whistleblower, to reveal and confirm the CIA's use of waterboarding as torture to get confessions from prisoners. And while he didn't get it all right, he was the first to break the silence. But Kiriakou says he became a marked man, and several years later, he was charged with revealing other classified information, and he served nearly 23 months in prison.
Tonight's story is about something of much less consequence and significance, but it does give us an idea of what makes whistleblowers tick. With John Kiriakou, old habits seem to die hard, and he is now in the middle of another controversial whistleblower episode. This one much less significant and much more personal, involving his ex-wife and her company, the big defense contractor, Northrop Grumman.
I intercepted emails between my then wife and a Northrop Grumman executive. It showed that an affair had been taking place for quite some time, well over a year. And and it showed that they were meeting in different foreign locales in order to perpetuate and to continue this affair.
So essentially, you were going to Northrop Grumman because you wanted to get your wife in trouble?
No. Frankly, the way I saw it is my wife got herself in trouble. To me, this was evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, which is actually the definition of whistleblowing that is in the whistleblower protection law. And so what I wanted to do was to alert Northrop Grumman to the fact that this waste, fraud, and abuse was taking place.
What happened after you alerted them? What happened? What did they tell you to do?
Well, I called the company's ethics hotline. It's an anonymous ethics hotline, and I told them what I had. I described it in great detail. And the ethics officer with whom I spoke told me that I could either send everything to her and she would distribute it to the principals, or I could send it to the principals directly. I elected to do both.
Kiriakou sent a load of information that he had discovered, along with personal emails from his wife's account and photos she had sent to her business associate, some of them in which she was very scantily dressed.
What I expected was that the company would do an investigation and then take care of the problem. What they did, though, is they turned all the evidence over to my wife, and then they called the police and the Commonwealth's attorney's office and filed charges against me.
And what charges did they file?
Well, interestingly enough, the charges were revenge porn. She was wearing thong underwear or lingerie or bikinis. And in two of the pictures, which were the most revealing, I took a Sharpie and I blacked out the naughty bits. So there was no porn. There was no revenge porn, and there was no criminal intent, certainly.
But you ended up being charged with a crime.
I was charged with a crime. And then to make matters worse, after I was charged with a crime, the Arlington County, Virginia Police Department and an FBI group raided my house. It was 22 officers altogether, raided my house. With a sledgehammer, they smashed a hole in the wall of my kitchen. They took all of my electronics, my desktop, my laptop, my telephone, my iPad, my iPod, everything. They even took the GPS out of my car, all under the guise of searching for more revenge porn. There was no revenge porn. There never was any revenge porn. And so in the end, the original charges against me were dropped, and no new charges were filed as a result of that raid.
Kiriakou has now brought a lawsuit against the police, his ex-wife, and Northrop Grumman, which said it had no comment on what it called a personal matter. Kiriakou's lawyer is Bruce Fine.
Northrop Grumman really was perfidious here. After all, John played by the books. You know, he's not reckless. He asked for guidance from their whistleblower hotline. How should I do this, you know? That pledges anonymity. Anonymity, as you well know, Brian, is one of the earmarks of any successful and viable whistleblower program, because there's this fear of retaliation. I mean, this is a mockery of a whistleblower program. You know, it turns into a program to discourage whistleblowing because Northrop Grumman will betray you.
It's clear you were unhappy with what was going on with your wife and your marriage was falling apart. Was it a kind of revenge whistleblowing?
I wouldn't call it revenge whistleblowing. In retrospect, maybe I should have been a little more forgiving, I suppose, when I stumbled across this information. But you know, all in all, now with hindsight being 2020, I still believe that I did the right thing.
This, of course, this pales in comparison to the whistleblowing you did about the CIA and the U.S. government's campaign of torture.
It does. This is definitely the minor leagues compared to that whistleblowing, which was also necessary.
But you have it in you just to blow the whistle, it looks like.
I spoke to a psychologist one time who was writing a book on whistleblowers, and he told me that one of the things he had discovered was that whistleblowers have an unusually well-defined sense of right and wrong, that it's far more well-defined than the population at large. And whistleblowers actually can't help themselves. They have to report evidence of wrongdoing, of waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality. It's just the way we're wired.
All right, well, John Kiriakou, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
As we said, Northrop Grumman declined to comment, as did Kiriakou's former wife, Heather, and the Arlington County Police Department. Coming up next, the winners and losers in this week's media. See if you agree with the editors of Mediaite about what they say about Chris Wallace and Donald Trump. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network. And we close out our program tonight with this week's winners and losers in the media, as chosen by the editors of Mediaite. And we're joined by Aidan McLaughlan, editor-in-chief of Mediaite, which, like the Law and Crime Trial Network, is part of the Dan Abrams media empire. Aidan, thank you for being here. Let's begin with one of your big winners, Chris Wallace, whose contentious interview with President Trump over the weekend is still being talked about many days later. Look at this one clip, and we'll talk about it.
It's really because they want to defund the police, and Biden wants to defund the police.
Sir, he does not.
Look, he signed a charter with Bernie Sanders. I will get that one, just like I was right on the mortality rate. Did you read the charter that he agreed to?
It says nothing about defunding the
Oh,
police.
really? It says abolish. It says defund. Let's go.
All right.
Get me the charter, please.
All right.
Chris, you've got to start studying for these.
He says defund the police.
White House never sent us evidence the Bernie-Biden platform calls for defunding or abolishing police because there is none. It calls for increased funding for police departments that meet certain standards. Biden has called for redirecting some police funding for related programs like mental health counseling.
So Chris Wallace really challenged the president and was proven to be right, Aidan.
Right. So that was a great little moment right there from Chris Wallace's interview, which aired on Fox News Sunday this weekend with the president. It was a really wide-ranging interview. It was the first that Chris Wallace actually got with the president since 2018 when he interviewed him, I believe, around the midterms. And it was actually heralded as one of the better interviews that any reporter has done with President Donald Trump. And I think that's mainly because of the moment that you just saw, like the one you just saw right there, which is that Chris Wallace will challenge the president on a claim that he's making. And actually twice in that interview, Trump asked an aide for evidence to bolster a claim that Chris Wallace was challenging him on. And when Chris Wallace was presented with the evidence, he looked at it and realized that it didn't hold water. The other example was when President Donald Trump claimed that the United States had one of the best coronavirus mortality rates in the world. Chris Wallace challenged him on that. Trump asked an aide to provide him evidence of it. Chris Wallace did the fact-checking and found out that the president's claim was wrong. So, it was a really good interview, not just because Chris Wallace challenged the president in real time. He also did the work afterwards in fact-checking the other claims that the president made, so that the package that aired on Fox News Sunday this weekend actually had the full spread of the claims that the president was making were challenged and actually put in appropriate context.
And Aidan, it also seems to underscore the shortcomings of other major interviews done with the president by some very big-name anchors.
Yeah, I think when you compare this interview to a lot of the other interviews that President Donald Trump has done, most of which he's done on Fox News, which is Chris Wallace's network, there's a bit of a discrepancy in how he's treated. Margaret Sullivan at the Washington Post actually had a column this week that said that, despite Chris Wallace doing a really, really good interview with the president and calling him out on, false claims that he's making, that only really serves to underscore how bad the rest of the network does, the opinion hosts she's referring to, when they interview the president and let him skate on everything that Chris Wallace challenged him on.
Exactly. And then Fox News got hit this week with another bit of bad news, a lawsuit by two women who had worked there claiming widespread sexual misconduct, including against Ed Henry, allegations of rape, which he has denied. He has since been fired by Fox News. That's another big headache for them, isn't it?
Yeah, he was fired, Ed Henry, on July 1st after a Fox Business producer made an allegation of misconduct. Fox News investigated it and fired Ed Henry. Now we have found out what that allegation was. It was a Fox Business producer who has accused Ed Henry of rape. It's a pretty serious allegation. And in that lawsuit, there's also a couple of other Fox News hosts that have been named and accused of sexual harassment by a frequent guest on the network by the name of Kathy Aru.
So we'll see more of that coming out in court, as Ed Henry's lawyer says they're going to challenge it, and look forward to that.
Yep.
Moving on to another winner, Poppy Harlow at CNN, who took on a Trump campaign aide, Mercedes Schlapp. Let's look at this and see what you think of this.
You know what Joe Biden said?
Mercedes, let's stick on the president. I promise we can get back to Joe Biden in a moment.
Joe Biden, because none of the press wants to ask questions to Joe Biden.
Mercedes, oh, that's not true.
And he's
Mercedes,
the candidate.
Shouldn't
we know what Joe Biden stands for?
We should, and we should absolutely know what the president leading in this pandemic stands for.
Will he let you guys ask questions? That's my question.
It is the single most relevant issue for Americans at this moment in time.
And we all agree.
Mercedes, Mercedes, please, I think it does a disservice. We got time, so we don't have to talk over one another. I think it does a disservice to our viewer to do that. Let's not fight. Let's talk about the facts.
Another contentious interview and some real-time fact-checking, right?
Right. So that was the beginning of the interview between Mercedes Schlapp, who works on the Trump 2020 campaign, and Poppy Harlow, a CNN anchor. It actually was quite civil from then on out, after Poppy basically established that she wanted to have a real debate as opposed to an argument. And I found it a really refreshing interview to watch. I actually watched it live because Poppy Harlow basically questioned Mercedes Schlapp on the president's coronavirus response, why the administration was trying to discredit Dr. Anthony Fauci, its top infectious disease expert, and a series of other questions. And when Mercedes Schlapp responded by effectively sort of trying to spin the viewers and the CNN, her CNN anchor, Poppy Harlow actually had evidence to back up her point. And it was a really well-researched and well-founded debate that followed. Well, one example is that Mercedes Schlapp dismissed Quinnipiac polls that showed President Donald Trump down 15 points to Joe Biden, saying that those polls are not to be trusted and that they're all sort of fake, as the president has claimed. And Poppy Harlow actually had a series of tweets that the president has put out praising that very polling company. So it was stuff like that where she had sort of a deep backbench of evidence that she could back up her points with, and sort of put Mercedes Schlapp in the hot seat. And it made for a really compelling and fact-based interview.
And let's jump ahead to one more winner, Joy Reid at MSNBC in her new 7 p.m. anchor slot. She really got quite the booking for her first show this week. Former Vice President Biden and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Let's look at what Biden had to say to her.
You naming a black woman as your vice presidential running mate?
I am not committed to naming any but the people I've named, and among them there are 4 black women. So that decision is underway right now. And by the way, black women have supported me my entire career. You all act like all of a sudden there was an epiphany in South Carolina. I have had over a 96%, 94% rating in the state with the 8th largest black community in the United States of America, Delaware. And so they're the ones, as that old saying goes, that brought me to the dance. I have been loyal. They have been loyal to me. And so it is important that my administration, I promise you, will look like America.
So with bookings like that, she's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the cable news wars, right?
For sure. And, you know, we at Mediaite, we've been pretty critical of Joy Reid, namely because of the old blog posts that she had that she claimed were hacked, which was a pretty dubious claim. We've been pretty harsh on Joy Reid. She had her debut taking over Chris Matthews' slot on MSNBC on Monday night, and had some serious bookings. As you said, Joe Biden. She also had Hillary Clinton on. And it was a pretty compelling show. She earned praise from LeBron James for the show, and also got 2.6 million viewers, which is a huge number for MSNBC. So a strong debut for Joy Reid there.
Very strong. She's off to a great start with lots of compliments from all over the media sphere. Aidan McLaughlan, thank you so much for joining us and your insights into this week's winners and losers in the media. And thanks to all you for joining us, and to the team at Law and Crime for getting us on the air and off the air.